Give me 1 second. I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were talking about ADHD. Now ADD falls under the ADHD umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
So there's two, it's ADHD, but there's two types. There is the inattentive, where the kid will like have problems focusing, and then there is the one that would be with hyperactivity and impulsivity. So it's either just inattentive, or it can be inattentive with hyperactivity and impulsivity. So there's those two, but they're all now called ADHD.
okay.
Yes.
Okay, so just to let everyone know, because I realize the video where we talked about your history isn't ever going to be seen since we had discussed you, but essentially you found yourself diagnosed with ADHD, and you have 3 brothers, and you all have it, as well as dyslexia. So you've been a member of the learning, you say the LD community, that learning disability?
I like to call it learning difference, but yeah, it's... Yeah.
Okay, so you've found yourself as a member of that community, and didn't necessarily ever want to teach, but then found your mom was an awesome advocate, and ended up changing your course in college and finding your path. Now doing this for the past couple of years, and you absolutely love it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that is perfect.
Okay, perfect. So that catches everyone up. They missed the bit on what's to come, but that's okay. We'll advertise that and share that. We have Montessori next Tuesday, and then we also have thermography in the works, which is a big word, but really cool technology that can help anyone with boobs, really. So, okay. So let's get back to some of these questions. So I understand that. Is there a genetic component to ADHD that?
So it is basically it is a difference in the brain. So at an early stage, every kid is super, they're like making all of these neural connections, and the brain is developing. But ADHD, another way of saying it would be like a difference in those neural connections, where the brain doesn't make those connections in the same way that a typical brain does, because of the traits that were passed on. So normally there's like from 17 to 24 different types of traits that affect ADHD. Like that if you have any one of those traits, you could be predisposed to have ADHD.
Okay.
So
what are the signs that a child might have ADHD, and how early would those present themselves, so parents could try to kind of pick up on some warning signs beforehand?
Yeah. So it is very interesting, because as I started teaching, my thought was that you couldn't really tell until the kid was like in 2nd or 3rd grade, because that's where kids start to interact with one another. But as I studied more, and I realized it's from when they're babies. You can tell, because ADHD is a lack of focus. So if you see the baby, like a baby that's like has a lot of trouble with focusing maybe on one object, and they're like just looking around, and like they have like this tendency to not be able to, I would say, like look at something for a long time, or when an adult is talking or there's songs playing, like they have this very hard time in like looking at that object for a little bit. And it's very interesting, because it's something that you would never look at if you didn't know that that's maybe a sign of a kid having ADHD. Of course, it's just a sign.
Sure. So you can look at children, and in a group of them, you could probably pick up, have a hunch on which one might be wired a little bit differently and have ADHD. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So for parents who have their little baby at home, and whether it's the first year, 2 years of their lives, what are some of the other signs that are kind of typical signs to look for, which might, ping them and say, okay, maybe we should go see if we can get some resources?
So when they're babies, that's like the first sign that you can do. There's also exercises where you can actually try and like sort of like test the focus of your child by, let's say, like playing a sound of them or like showing them a toy and trying to keep them entertained. And as you see normally, because I have seen this like in video and also like in person sometimes, like you'll be doing it and the kid like will tune in and out. But then after the kid grows a little bit more, you can also see, most specifically when it's like hyperactivity and impulsivity, when it comes with also that, what we called the H of ADHD for a while, that was the hyperactivity. You can see the kid also having that really hard time focusing, but also like not knowing what to do with their bodies sometimes. Like, those kids that are running around, like kids, normally will be very hyper when they're little. Yeah. But if they're doing this in situations where you're like, this is not the appropriate situation, and it's constantly happening, like either you're like at a restaurant with your family and the kid can never stay still in their seats and they have to leave, but all the time. Or let's say if you're religious and you go to like a religious event and the kid just has always a really hard time there. Or at school, normally that's a really good place where, you can sort of see those type of things. Sure. And I would say the last, or not the last, but one of the most telling and obvious situations would be with impulsivity, where you're trying to tell the kid to do something or like stop doing something and they're just not able to stop doing that behavior. All of this taking into account, you have to be looking at, kids will always be kids and they'll want to move and jump around, and sometimes they'll eat the candy because, that's their desire. Mm-hmm. But if this becomes more of like a behavioral thing where they just cannot stop themselves and where it's becoming inappropriate, or how they would call it inappropriate in like a growing degree, because as kids grow, it just starts to, school is more of like sit down, don't do this, so it starts to become harder and more telling as they grow.
So it sounds to me, and granted I've we've got 5, it sounds to me that probably school is the place where most of the diagnoses start happening, because here I'm sitting going, gosh, I don't know, because I know I have a squirmer, but I don't know if it's more squirmy than normal. I mean, they're all born who they are, so it's like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I'm listening to you with intent going, do I have that going on in my household or not? And I don't know. So that's where I'm thinking. For me, I started kind of thinking, well, maybe it is a situation that is not just squirmy legs, squirmy whatever, but there's something else going on once they got in the school system. And then, they're able to compare peers where, other than play dates, a parent's not able to compare peers. Mm-hmm. And what other kids are able to do. Not that you want to compare your kids because they're all so unique, but I imagine that, is that true that most of the diagnoses are kind of once kids get into the school situation? And it really kind of hard beforehand unless it's super obvious.
Yeah, normally that's where most diagnosis happens. Also, if you think about it, the school, kids are in school most of the time. Like when I was a school teacher, I thought about it myself and I was like, I spend more time with this kid than the kid does with their parents. So it starts to become more obvious because of time, but also because of the way a lot of schools are set up. It is, unfortunately, it's a lot of like sitting down and listening and, that sometimes is not age appropriate, but it's also the hardest thing for a kid that has ADHD with hyperactivity, to just sit down and, you know.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, so we have a question that came in live. I want to kind of hit a little bit more general before we go right to it. What strategies can parents apply at home to keep kids busy and interested in order to avoid, kind of chaotic behavior is the phrase used, but
Yeah.
you have
I think,
best practices?
yeah, so there's a lot of things that you can do. Of course, it's going to depend on the child because each kid has their interests, and I think that's the most important thing of all. When you're looking at a kid with ADHD, a lot of times they're like really struggling in school if it's like hyperactivity or even focus, because even though they might be very, very smart, they're not being able to show this. So I think the first thing that you have to do is like really assess the kid and what they like to do, and from there you can like move on forward. Like, for example, if it's a kid that has, is very impulsive and hyperactive, something that you can really focus on is like sports, or also like mindfulness techniques in the classroom of like, okay, you're gonna do sports after school. For example, my brother, he was this case, and he would go to like 3 sports classes after school, and he loved it, and that was his passion, and that's what he did, and that really helped him.
Okay.
And then also in class, because even though they're going to be in sports after school, you need to give them some tools for them to manage their hyperactivity in class, which would be maybe like fidgets or like breathing techniques, or like there's these bracelets that you can like move around, or the rings, or just a lot of my students before did like push-ups using the chair, where they use their hands to like push their body up. So they would just let the teacher know, like, I need to do these once in a while, and they can do them while they're like still listening. Sure. If it's a kid that loves to draw, letting them doodle while they're listening. Some kids can do that. So it really depends. I think that when it's a hyperactivity diagnosis, it's easier sometimes to give them tools. When it's someone that has ADHD, but it's more of just the focus and like the spacing out, you need a teacher that understands that and that knows how to provide constant checkings. And at home you can also do that, like like when they're doing their homework, like try and help them out and be like, what, let's do your homework 10 minutes at a time, and like do it for 10 minutes and then we'll do something else. So a lot of routine is really good for any kid with ADHD.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to jump to this live question. So for an ADHD child, they know that sport's very important. Should it be done before homework? And what about eating a meal or big snack after sport and homework time? I'm guessing that's after sport.
Yeah, so that actually for any kid, not only kids with ADHD, but if kids do sports, before they do their homework or before they go to school, it is amazing. There's some schools out there that have raised their test scores by like 80% in 1 year. Oh. Not by changing any academics, but only because they added the component of PE at the beginning of school. So any parent, I would say that, do that with your kid. But it is there, if it's beneficial for like a neurotypical kid, it is even more beneficial for kids with ADHD. That's generalizing. Of course, you have to look at the kid, but normally that's the case. And with meals, that exactly, I think it is good for them to maybe eat a meal. Like, they do sports, eat a meal, and then they start studying. Because what tend to happen a lot to me as a kid also, and I see it with a lot of my students, is before you start your homework routine, you have to like be ready, you know. And a lot of kids normally are like, okay, I'm doing my homework, and oh, but I want a snack now. And normally a neurotypical kid can take that little break, have a snack, and then continue. But with someone with ADHD, that can be like an hour of refocusing back into the homework. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. All makes sense, but that's good to have. I love that we're getting the real life experience. You know, it's not just theoretical what you've learned in a book. You've lived it, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome because you offer such a different, you know, perspective that is super helpful. So how do parents, or maybe you can share how you wish it had been done differently, or how it worked for you. How do they explain ADHD to their child who is diagnosed?
Yeah.
Depends on the age, you know, with what language you type of thing. But in general, maybe you can talk about that.
So I think that, of course, the language you'll use is different, but the narrative would be the same for any age. I think it's super important, I feel, for children to know. Sometimes that's the hardest part, you know, like for parents, sometimes they're so scared of labeling their child that they won't be like, oh my, you know, I don't want to tell my kid to tell him that they have ADHD because then this is going to be mark them for life. But you know what? Your child has ADHD and it doesn't have to suck, you know? It can be a good thing, you know? It can really, you know, give them this like advantage in other ways if you teach them that ADHD can be an advantage.
Yeah.
So I feel like, at least for me, it was super helpful for me to know what was going on. Like, why couldn't I concentrate, you know?
Right.
It was like, oh, it's because of this, you know? But so just telling your kid is very important, but telling them in a way that's not like, I really don't like the word learning disability, or like, you know, I think it's a difference in your brain, because that is literally what it is. When you look at pictures in the brain of a kid that has ADHD, it's a difference in the brain, in development, on the age where you'll develop all of your, you know, executive functions and all of this. So it's important for kids to know that they have it and that it is not a negative thing, but just a difference. And then I think it's also very important for the parents to, you know, develop an action plan, like have, let's say, the first 2 steps of like, you know what, we went to the psychologist, the psychiatrist, and we realized that your brain works differently, and we're going to start to do these 2 things, you know, and start small. Start by, like, I don't know, using a schedule at home and giving them like this cool fidget that now they're going to be able to use in class, you know. And it starts small, and then little by little, I think it's very important to have someone that knows how the ADHD works to help the parents guide the child. Yeah.
That's great. So with that, someone asked, does ADHD affect the IQ of my child?
Yeah, so actually that's a question that, as my personal experience, I had that question for myself as a kid. I was like, so I have this learning, just, you know, like this learning difference and like this thing, and I can't concentrate. Is it because I'm dumb? Like, what is it? And I know my brothers also had this question, and most of the clients that I work with, normally ADHD really affects like your self-esteem, because I think as ADHD people, we tend to think a lot about like, I have this amazing ideas and all of these things I want to do, but I just can't execute it because I space out. I don't know how to organize it. So I think more than you know, it of course does not affect your IQ. Like ADHD children and adults have this amazing potential, and I think that, you know, you have the IQ, it's just sometimes we just need help with the execution of it, of just like getting our thoughts together to do it. But like all of the potential is there, you know.
Yeah, so it sounds like executive functions are affected in the cortex. Okay, no, that makes sense. And anyone who's suffered from frontal cortex, executive function, traumatic brain injuries, like going, I get it, you know, because I've had that too, where I can't, you know, my ability to organize became much different after a TBI and stuff like that. So, okay, there are a lot of questions coming in. What are the most crucial accommodations an ADHD student should receive? Let's see, or get called disobedient in class for getting distracted. That was a comment, yeah. So what are the most crucial accommodations that an ADHD student should receive in class that you can share with us?
So, of course, it's going to depend a little bit on the student. If maybe, you know, you have a kid that's super hyperactive and then a kid that's super, you know, just lives in the moon and just, you know, they'll just sit there in the back and won't move, but will be spacing out all the time. So, let's say for kids that have the hyperactive one, I think it's constant little breaks is super important. Checkings is really important as well. And I would say just also the ability to have extra time sometimes is really important, because if in an exam you're not going to be able to be checking into the student like, hey, you need to give them that extra time for them to be able to, you know, they're going to space out once in a while, or they need to just take a little break, but you need to give them that flexibility of, you know, giving them the time to think and giving them the time to have those constant breaks. So a lot of my students, what I do is when they're having an exam, I'll help them study, but I'll be like, okay, let's study for 30 minutes and we stop. 30 minutes and then we stop. And then when they go into their classroom, they have the accommodation of taking the test for 30 minutes, taking a little pause, and then 30 minutes with the teacher telling them like, it's your pause time now, you know? So that's very important. And then with the ones that, you know, I feel they tend to fall through the cracks, which are the kids that will just be spacing out in the back and they won't say anything. Sure. I think the checkings are super important, and just checking in with them.
What does a check-in mean to you?
So in class, it's just calling on the student's name. Hey, you know, it depends on the student if they're shy or if they're not. But normally it's just at, you know, every 30 minutes, just checking in with the kid. Like, hey, how's it going? Like, you know, did you understand this? Maybe like asking them a little question about what, you know, they're learning in class in that moment, or the activity that you're doing, because it will bring them back to what, you know, it will help them focus.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. Let's see. Okay. So we've got a lot of questions coming in. We're going to have to try to get to these. Let's see.
Okay.
We got some, how does ADHD affect emotions? You talked a little bit about it can affect your self-esteem depending upon how it's kind of presented and also dealt with in the home and in the school and with friends and everything, right? Not a disability, it's a difference. And here are some skills and strategies to help make it a superpower. You know, I know a lot of folks who have ADD, possibly ADHD, but have gone on to do amazing things and are amazing CEOs and have identified their strengths and their weaknesses, and there are tools for some of the things that they need help with, and they kill it, right? So it's definitely can be a superpower for sure. But how does it affect emotions?
I think a lot of impulsivity, you know, when kids normally, because ADHD, it can be inattentiveness, like you can't focus.
Sure.
There's also the hyperactivity, and then there's the impulsivity. So I think, let's say I'm thinking of a student I had a few years ago. At the beginning, I'm going to be honest, I thought he was so rude. And then I realized it wasn't that he was rude. It's just he just had to say everything he was thinking. So it didn't matter if it was rude. It didn't matter if it was going to offend me or anybody in the classroom. He just couldn't filter anything out. So more than behavior, I think it's like an impulsivity thing, where they just can't, even physically, sometimes they'll just like, and you're like, whoa, what are you doing? And you'll be like, oh, you're so misbehaved. But it's not that, it's an impulsivity thing.
Yeah, and the lack of filter is all in the frontal cortex.
Exactly. Yeah.
Phineas Gage and that iron changed his person entirely. Okay, so that's one way it can affect emotions, and then I imagine it can probably affect self-esteem, as you said. Are there other things associated with ADHD and emotions, like any depression or anything like that?
So no, it depends on how you manage the ADHD. Of course, it can lead. If there's a kid that has a really high ADHD, he's not giving the supports. He's, and I have seen it a lot. Like in class, teachers just don't understand that it is an impulsivity thing, and they think it's a behavior thing. When a kid listens to a teacher telling them, oh, you're so misbehaved, stop talking, don't do that, like, they'll start to believe it, and it comes to a point where they become, like, numb to that, and they'll just start to behave that way because they were told that they were misbehaved their whole life. So then that leads to a lot, there have been a lot of studies that later say that, ADHD, a bunch of people in prison have it, but it is because it has not been managed in a positive way,
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any, let's see, these questions, I'm going to come back to them, but there are questions that I kind of want to group them a little bit just so that we can follow a little bit more organization and then how it goes. Let's see. So with regard to nutrition and kind of talking about managing it, how much does nutrition affect ADHD in your experience and studies?
So I think that to talk about like nutrition, like a lot of families use it as, instead of medication, they will use nutrition. For example, I once had a student that couldn't take the medications because they had another, diagnosis for something else, and they couldn't take the medication. So the way that they were able to manage, the need for, what they would say, a lot of people are like, oh, you need medication because ADHD, oh, you need medication. But there are so many routes to solving, that issue that, sometimes there's kids that do need a very big intervention. And that intervention can be either cognitive therapy, nutrition, medication, a little bit of everything, or some of take and choose what it is that you need. But for nutrition, it is important to, and I sound like, a nutritionist, you have to eat healthy. You need to get the nutritions you need. Of course, like, there have been like food colorings and ADHD. There's such a big clash there.
Yeah. So eat
and it is
healthy.
Yeah, so it is a lot of eating healthy, and there's also, I wrote it down because, sometimes, I forget things, but there are a lot of studies that have said that, like corn syrup, cereals, nuts, gluten, and all of these things are not really good for ADHD, and following a Mediterranean diet is like amazing.
Awesome.
That's like,
I'm surprised in nuts, but maybe because they have a little bit of, like, peanuts have fungal stuff going on. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, but it's like a study that I read once, and I have talked to some psychologists for my, my clients, and they have recommended that. So yeah.
Okay, well, it makes sense. I've heard the Mediterranean diet is a good one to follow no matter what. So
yeah,
makes sense, right? Eating clean and getting rid of the high fructose corn syrup and all the colorings and all that for a number of things.
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about other treatment options, cognitive therapy, nutrition, medication. Just in the Toolbox series, we talked about chiropractic care and how they've had amazing results with chiropractic care as well. Do you, in your, I guess it depends on the child, so there are a lot of questions. What's more effective, medication or ADHD coaching? What is the best ADHD medication? Are there side effects of ADHD meds? Are there other natural supplements that help with ADHD instead of medication? And I think obviously it depends on the person, the child. Overarching is it depends on them. But ADHD coaching is something, and if you want to comment on any of those, feel free. But what is ADHD coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's what I do. Like one of my services is that, I work with the kid in helping them develop all of those, executive functions and impulsivity control. Because everything comes down to the end of ADHD has a really hard time with all of the frontal cortex, and that's like one of the last areas to develop in your brain. And for ADHD kids, it's like 3 years behind the whole developing. It starts in the middle and it starts developing as a whole, and this is the last area. So we really try and help the kids, stimulate those neural connections with all of what is like, impulsivity control, like exercises and, time management, where we use like visual clocks and we draw on them and we're like, okay, we're going to do a checklist that has like time frames for each of your homework activities, and we're going to keep your back in this way. We're going to make a checklist. Like it really depends because there's so many executive functions. But it is guiding the kid in really getting to know how they think, and looking at their strengths. There's some kids that are super creative and like super artistic. So we'll use like a super artistic checklist to, they'll draw what they have to do. And then just by doing that, they're like, oh, okay, now I get what I have to do. So, yeah.
Okay, so I imagine it's difficult to say if it's more effective or less effective than medication, but and then there's probably also a happy medium balance between them, depending on, again, the child or the person.
Yeah, I think that in most cases, and not because I do it or anything, but I think that it's important to have some type of support apart from just the exercise, the sleep, the nutrition, or the medication. You always need like a structure or a guide, because you need to help them develop those executive function skills and give them that stimulus at home. Either you as a parent or getting a specialist that can help your child.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you find that rooms of kids with ADHD are particularly messier than otherwise because of the lack of organization or the challenges with organization?
So it's super interesting because I have seen both. Where, I have a kid that he would leave when I worked in schools, like he would leave his water bottle. He would leave everything, like his backpack. One time he left a shoe. I was like, I don't, so you can, yes. So I don't know how that happened, but it did. And, sometimes that case can happen, but then there's also the cases where kids with ADHD have grown in a household of very organized parents, and they use it as a coping mechanism. Like, since there's so much going on in their brain and they can't, I was more of this type of ADHD kid where there was so much going on in my head and I couldn't really organize it in my head because I was like spacing out all the time. And I'm super visual, so I was super organized, but to the point where it was super distracting for me when things were not organized.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, interesting. Are there any natural supplements that help with ADHD instead of medication that you know of that are kind of some of the favorites?
Yeah, there's zinc, there's also iron
Okay.
and magnesium.
Okay.
But of course those, like, you can give that to your child to help them concentrate, but it's good to also like do this with like a specialist, like
Sure.
a psychiatrist that can like tell you to what level you need it, because it really varies upon the child.
And then what are the main ADHD medications or any of the best that most of your patients have had success with?
So that is a very tough question, because there's a lot of medications out there.
Yeah.
But then there's so many different chemical composures of our brain that it really is. Normally what I see when parents choose to go on the medication route, it's it's like a hit or miss. Sometimes you'll have to try a few.
Yeah.
There's Concerta, there's Ritalin. Those are the two that most parents use, but then the other ones, it's more if like those two don't work, then you'll go to the other ones. Because there are sometimes some side effects, like like the mood can change sometimes, like the irritability can increase sometimes if you don't give them the right dosage or the right medication for them. And with picky eaters, like ADHD kids that take medication, normally they're not hungry a lot, so it takes the appetite is like totally lost. Sometimes. So it really depends, and it is like a journey that you'll have to like
figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so is it true, because I was a psych major and I took brain and behavior, which was a really hard but really interesting class, and they talked about Ritalin, and Ritalin is a stimulant, and it stimulates different parts of the brain, so that actually it allows better focus on one aspect of whatever the is. Is that generally true of all ADHD medication? It's a stimulant.
Yes, that's mostly how they work. They just do it in different ways.
Gotcha.
And I think they have made it like that because they see that, sometimes it affects individuals in another area, but their primary focus is all of them stimulating the brain to be able to focus.
Yeah.
But they just help the brain stimulate in different ways.
Sure. Which makes sense with the doodling and listening to class, or, fidgeting.
Yeah.
It's other parts of the brain, so you can try to hone your focus a little bit. It all makes sense. It's amazing. Okay, we're doing well. We're over our time, but we've still got a lot of questions that we're going to try to run through real quickly. Okay.
Yes, for sure.
So we talked about executive functions, and yes, ADHD does affect them. And you have a list of them. There's coaching that you can do to help them establish strategies for developing their executive functions. But can you run down a list of it? It can affect organization. It can affect focus. Obviously, a list of.
So it's like time management, focus, organization. It can also affect like all of that impulsivity, like the stop or continue type of. Do I stop doing this, or do I continue saying what I'm gonna say? Yeah, that's a big one actually.
Yeah.
Like, and it happens a lot. And then it can also affect in organization. It's very broad, but like maybe like sequencing things, like being able to like manipulate what you have to do and taking things by chunks.
Okay.
That's something that can also be affected. I normally tell parents that executive functions is, think about your kid doing a project. What would be the area that you think they would struggle with the most? And it's normally something with executive functions when you have ADHD. So when I work with kids, it's an ongoing list. There's also like spatial things involving executive functions and stuff like that. But I think it's more of like, you need to really look at a whole of what a project entails, and then from there you can pinpoint, maybe it's the impulsivity and the lack of being able to stop saying something, or the my kid can't do a checklist, and they can't do that. Or more of like they can organize everything, but when it's time to turn it in, they can't do that. So it's executive functions is anything that has to do with executing a task. So it's
Gotcha.
very, very broad.
Everything along the journey, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Let's see. So how can, if someone determines or has a sinking suspicion or anything like that, that they ADHD might be at play, how can they get accommodations for their son in school? What are some of the community resources available? And how would you recommend they go about building a community of, like an LD community, to give the parents the support that they need, which will only benefit their child?
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
So I think the most important thing as a parent is, also trust your gut. Like, your child. And if you think that they might have ADHD, talk with the teacher. Like, normally most teachers are supportive, and you can talk to them and tell them. And normally when I have had parents come to me and be like, oh, I think my kid has ADHD, I'm not like, what? No, totally not. I'm like, yes, I have seen the same things you see at home, So raising awareness with the teacher is great, because then you can collaborate with them since the beginning. So you don't have to wait until, because normally if you want your kid to get accommodations, you'll of course have to get them diagnosed with a psychiatrist. And then after that, you're going to have to give the evaluation, the form, the diagnostic, to the school. And then with the school, you'll do a meeting after a couple of weeks, and you will try and get something called a 504 for your child, or an IEP. Depending on the states, they do it a little bit different. But you'll have to do like a meeting where the teacher comes in, the principal comes in. Maybe you can even bring your own advocate for the kid. And you also have to go into the meeting. I have had meetings where the kid also joins and advocates for themselves, depending on their age. And from there, you'll talk and you'll discuss what you think is most necessary for your child. Sure. So having the teacher from the beginning to help you with that, because you're the parent, but they're the professional in education. So just having that is really great. And if you don't have a teacher that's supportive, then you can get, someone like what I do in my business, where we go and we can help you and we can advocate for your child in that meeting. And then from there, you'll just do, you'll use the 504 or IEP for the child, extra time, check-ins, it depends. So, yes.
Okay, so how have you found is easiest to build an LD community? And do you have any tips? Are there Facebook groups? Are there?
So I think something that's super important is to be able to get, when you're going to join a community that supports LD, which there are, like one of them would be like, for example, you can join, it's something called 0 to 3 national program.
Yep.
And that's a great, it's it can be free depending on like where you are economically, but I have had students that use this program, and it's an amazing place where they have like neurologists, therapists, teachers, and they help you help your kid with their executive functions, with the diagnosis. So going to places like that is very helpful. Yeah. But also, I think the most helpful thing is, you have to be an advocate for your child, especially if they're young and they can't advocate for themselves. So, a lot of schools have, a parent group or something like that. And I know there's schools out there, for example, the school that I went to, my mom and another group of moms opened a group of parents that had kids that had LD, differences. So they would advocate, and they would try and see, like, okay, you know what, I want to have this specialist come and train the teachers, and but also just being involved with your child's education. If you don't have a group like that, and you try and have constant communication with the teacher, I think that's a great way too, because just letting them know that it's a difference, and that it has potential can make a huge change.
That's great. So some of the live questions, what are common ADHD diagnosis mistakes?
So I would say one of the first mistakes is, and I see it so much, and right now I can say it, but sometimes it's really hard to have parents change their mind about medication or not. And so it's medicating from the beginning, from the get-go. Like, this is the first thing we have to do is give them medication, because it's not, you have to try other things. I'm not against medication, because I have had students where medication helps them so much, and they're able to show their strengths so much more with medication, but it is not totally necessary for everybody. Like, some kids with a good night routine, sports, and some executive function, training, they're able to succeed. Where some kids, with just the fidget and just having the check-ins by the teacher, they're able to, improve a lot. So I would say that is a very big error, I would say, at the beginning.
Go straight to
And then also when, I have had parents that are very against medication, and they don't want that. And, as, I work with this and I'm in this field, but sometimes it is necessary, So I think having that flexibility and that open line of communication with the psychiatrist, the parents, and the school is super important.
That makes sense.
Yes.
There's a question, what age can you be diagnosed with ADHD? And I know you said it can be seen in babies. But what's kind of the earliest diagnosis that you've come across? Because we talked about most diagnoses are once kids hit school. What's the youngest that you've come across?
So you can diagnose ADHD from like age 5 or 6, but I normally see it later. But it can be diagnosed at that time, depending on the specialist. But I have seen specialists that do it at that age. But I think it is extremely important to, as a parent, just, be vigilant of, like, if you see your toddler having a very hard time with focus. And, a great way of, like, telling is, like, during, like, let's say, like, Christmas events where all of your family is there, and maybe there's a bunch of toddlers, or if you have a bunch of kids, like, you can also, like, I know that comparing is not good, but it is a good source of just getting to know the other kids around you. So it's diagnosed until like 5 or 6, but it can, you can also start as a parent doing those like schedules and routines, and that can help your child with ADHD.
Yeah, it sounds
you're helping them.
Because it sounds like if you can identify it earlier, the 0 to 3 program ages out at 3, and then there's a gap between 3 to 5 when they're in kindergarten. But identify it then, you can start employing some of the strategies. I think that's a win-win for everyone, right?
Because the brain is like, when at that 0 to 3, it's for a reason. Like, you're doing, as a baby has so many neural connections, and as we grow older, it's crazy because we lose some of them.
Yeah, they prune them.
So it's like you're helping them develop those that maybe it's harder for them to develop, but you're using those outlines and those different types of like exercises that help the brain still create those pathways. So
Sure.
even though it can't be officially diagnosed,
Yeah.
you can still help your child. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, and then someone asked, how do I know if I have ADHD? And someone who's pretty aware of themselves, but maybe confused. Like, so
I think it's the question that you can ask yourself is, can I focus, and for like how long, and what gets me distracted, you know, because everybody gets distracted by like, you know, noises and stuff. But like, for example, me, if you put a TV in front of me in a restaurant, I won't be able to talk to you. Like,
okay.
I just won't, because, you know, that focus is really hard for me.
Sure.
So those stimulus, so you can like see, okay, if I have 3 things that are going on around me and they distract me, you know, like for example, right now there's this light glitching right here next to me, and that's making me so aware of that, and I want to focus on that instead of the conversation. So that's like I'm doing it, but because I have had the practice, you know. But
gotcha.
Yeah, so it would be that. Yeah.
So someone also asked, can a student who have excellent grades be diagnosed with ADHD?
Yes, of course. So, you know, the diagnosis comes with everything. You can have a kid that has excellent grades, but just, you know, is super disorganized, and, you know, they still have super good grades. But, you know, as you can also, something that I see a lot is like someone that has ADHD gets the diagnosis, gets a little bit of that ADHD coaching, and then they just thrive, you know, because they have had the support of like, oh, this is how I organize myself, all of those weaknesses. So a lot of times ADHD kids can create those exercises and like those, you know, like organizing super well. Like if you see a kid that's super organized,
yeah,
maybe they develop those skills by themselves,
yeah,
you know, but it takes a lot of effort. So you can see a kid that gets good grades before their diagnosis, as you can see someone that gets really bad grades, gets a diagnosis, and that gets super good grades. You can see everything. Yeah.
Okay, so the questions keep coming. As I said, this is a topic because people start bringing up anxiety versus ADHD, which I think we're seeing a lot more of it after the pandemic too. You know, and that aren't used to you know, having either, right, or panic attacks. Those are kind of all new on the scene. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to have to take down the questions that we've received live and then set up another session with you, if that's okay with you, to try to address some of these other things. They're definitely inquiring minds, and I want to be able to deliver as many answers to folks as possible. Maybe with one, we can leave on one asked by Manuel. It's, how do I create the most productive environment at home for a child with ADHD? And I know we talked about schedules and check-ins, and is there anything else that you can think about? Maybe, you know, thinking about the age from that young 2-year-old, you know, who maybe there's a suspicion that there's something going on more than just a squirmy toddler, all the way through, because I'm sure there are structures that help anyone with this and get a little head start.
I think something that also helps a lot is with that impulsivity that many times comes with ADHD, is that talking out loud of like why I'm doing a process, or like, oh, somebody just, you know, said something to me. I'm going to first think about what I want to say, and then I'm going to say, I'm thinking that I want, like, let's say somebody just told me if I want to eat a pancake. And so you'll be like, okay, I really like pancakes, and I just had breakfast, so maybe I'll have to wait a couple of hours, and then I can have it after I eat lunch as dessert. You know, so like that, taking the kid through that process of thinking and like filtering, that's a great one that you can start doing. Even if a kid, I say like anything that's executive function related that you do with your child since they're young, even if they don't have ADHD, it's going to help. So I think any parent should do that, of like, you know, outlining and organizing and keeping that routine at home where, like, you know, I don't know, a lot of houses, you'll take off your shoes when you go in, and you'll, you know, so those type of things also help a lot.
Okay. All right. That's great. All these things that my mom, she was a school teacher. She said routines are really important, and my life doesn't often allow for them. They kind of go with mom, and and we get it done. But it all makes sense. So I think there are so many questions coming in. So I thank you so much. I think it's, as I said earlier, it's really an amazing perspective, because we didn't even get into dyslexia, right? But somebody asked, what's the best university for a dyslexic student? I don't know if you have an answer for that, but
it depends on the kid, but I know there's a couple that really support kids with dyslexia. We can do another live on dyslexia, of course.
There's a lot of interest in this topic, so I think what we'll do is we'll cull all the questions from the live, and we'll set up another session with you. And if you are so willing, we'll go through and pick up kind of where we left off. But it's been an amazing discussion, super informative, super. I mean, my eyes see things differently now, and that's the whole point of these things, which is so great. Whether it's my kids or family or whomever, friends, you know, it's really been great. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and that glitching light, couldn't even tell, because clearly you practice what you preach, and you're able to nail it and use it as a superpower. So thank you so much, Amparo. It was really great.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
All right. Well, we'll figure it out when we're going to meet up again. But thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for asking your questions. Apologize we can't get to them. As you know, I never run long on these. We ran super long, but it was super interesting, and you guys were game. So we'll come back, and we'll make sure all of your questions are answered. Okay, everyone? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.